Alrighty, y'all. Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. So, yesterday it was just announced that Dricus Du Plessis and Kamaru Usman will be facing each other at UFC Oklahoma. So today, I'm going to take an early look at this fight and the co-main event of this fight, which is going to be supposedly the co-main event. But I'm actually very excited for this fight in general. DDP, former UFC middleweight champion, and DDP, Kamaru Usman, former welterweight champion. So two former champions in two different weight classes. It's gonna be a very good fight. And then we do got the co-main event over here. Jared Cannonier facing Leroy Duncan, which is a good fight, especially for Christian going up more in the rankings. But just because Jared Cannonier hasn't been looking very impressive in his last few fights does not mean that he still cannot win this fight. I think it's a possibility that he could beat a guy like Leroy Duncan. But without any further ado, let's get into this video. Let's take now. All right, first here we're gonna take a look at the main event here: DDP versus Kamaru Usman. Now, listen, this is honestly a very good fight. Now if we take a Dricus Du Plessis resume, we just look in general. We just go all the way down. Getting into the UFC, he's a very high fighter, and he's a very high fighter. His two wins over Piros and Glines weren't really the two greatest wins. Then going over here beating Brad Charvis, beating Darren Till, beating Derek Brunson, which these three wins right here are good wins. Brad Charvis is currently kicked out of the down in the rankings. Darren Till cut from the UFC. I think Derek Brunson cut from the UFC. But then you'll be a former world champion and beating Robert Whitaker, knocking him out. Then, fights Sean Strickland in a very close fight where some of you guys think that Sean Strickland won this fight. Honestly, I thought DDP won this fight, but, could be some clue. And Sean Strickland, the current world champion, then, beating Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya, that's a very good win. Rematching Sean Strickland, dominating him this time. And then, lost to Hamza Chimaev, which, we just seen Hamza Chimaev lose to Strickland. So, overall, is DDP, one of the greatest middleweight fighters of all time? Not necessarily. Can he definitely gain his world title back against if he beats Kamaru Usman? Because this, like I said, this could be a title eliminator. Somebody could definitely jump over Narcine Imavov. I wouldn't be surprised because both their names are both very bigger than Narcine Imavov. They're both former world champions. Kamaru Usman, arguably one of the greatest welterweight fighters of all time. But if we look at we're going at Kamaru Usman's resume in the in the UFC. Getting into UFC, beating Hansa Hassan, then going at it, beating Leon Edwards, who was a high prospect at the time, won a decision over this to beat Alves. Then went in and had a good win over Sean Strickland, beating Morris, beating Meek. Then got a big fight against Damian Maia where he completely dominated Rafael dos Santos. Then got the title shot, dominated Tyron Woodley, who was the best welterweight at the time. Then, beating Kobe Covington in the first fight. Beating Jorge Masvidal the first time. Beating Gilbert Burns with a jab. This was when Kamaru Usman was at his best. He was just on a roll. He would get some crazy knockouts they wouldn't even see coming. Then knocking out Jorge Masvidal. Then, getting the rematch with Kobe Covington, beating him again. But then, this when his career starts to fall down. Losing to Leon Edwards. But, he was dominating that entire fight until Leon Edwards threw that head kick. Lost the first one, which wasn't really that competitive. The third one, which wasn't that competitive. Lost to Hamza Chimaev, where, I thought this fight should have been a draw. But, definitely Kamaru Usman had his success and, dominated his last fight against Joaquin Buckley. Which, I'm sorry to see that Buckley's kind of a fluke. His last fight over Sean Brady didn't really go as well. So, kind of an obvious that he was just going to absolutely beat Joaquin Buckley. But now, here's some problems I have here. Is that, for Kamaru Usman, is that how good will Kamaru Usman look against DDP? We all know he's past his prime. He's 2-3 in his last 5 fights. He hasn't had the most success throughout, as of most recently. But, how does he do moving up to 185? Does he look small? Does he look big? Because I'm concerned, what I'm concerned here is that there's a few things I'm concerned. One is the weight. How small is he going to look in this fight? If he's very small, I may just favor DDP. because that this is a fight where you gotta look at the weigh-ins to see how big they look. If he's like what like 183, 180, if he's like 183, 184, then yeah, that'll be most likely sure. Being 184 is not bad, but 183, yeah, nah. And then DDP on the what's my problem here for DDP? Because even though Kamaru Usman is past his prime, he definitely still has that wrestling. Has DDP got the wrestling better? Because Kamaru Usman is still a very good, fairly rated grappler. He gave Hamza Chimaev a tough time. Even though I get it, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to beat DDP just because he did better than what DDP did. It's just that his grappling is possibly just as good as Hamza Chimaev. So, but I just think Hamza Chimaev is definitely a little snappier with the takedowns. So how good will his grappling look coming up to 185? Will it look faster? Will he look slower? Will he look kind of drained? Not drained, but will he look will he be too weak at that weight? Because we go to his 185 fight with Hamza Chimaev. That was a 185. He was 184. But, definitely had some success with Hamza Chimaev. But how does he do against a very good striker like DDP? DDP has good striking. This man, I know some of you guys call this man a boring fighter, which, I so happen to disagree. But definitely, I think that DDP definitely had a good run. Beating Robert Whitaker, beating Sean Strickland twice, Israel Adesanya, who those are the most talked about middleweights in today's middleweight division. So that's a concern I have here for Kamaru Usman. And how does Kamaru Usman look on the feet? Does he get absolutely smoked on the feet? That could possibly happen. But it's a very interesting fight, especially for it being a second time. And I think it's an interesting fight because it's the Battle of the Africas, man. Part 2. And what I mean by Part 2, if you guys don't know, DDP versus Israel Adesanya, that was the Battle of the Africas. Because, Nigeria and South Africa are both from Africa. So, yeah. I feel like it's gonna be a hype fight. Honestly, I kind of wish there was a press conference to this fight because these two kind of hate each other. They've been going a little bit back and forth. They kind of really don't, like I said, they kind of really do not like each other as of right now. Just from the comments that DDP has said. So this is honestly a very fun fight. I could definitely see this be a close fight. This could be a very good wrestling match. I'm just concerned for the takedown for the wrestling of DDP, but who knows? Maybe DDP's wrestling has gotten better, but also, let's hypothetically say if Kamaru Usman is landing a lot of takedowns, DDP is known for pushing the pace even when he's tired. How tired would Kamaru Usman get from all those takedowns landing and him not get and DDP not giving up? That's just the concern thing I have for here. And does he strike with DDP? Because we have seen him strike before millions of times. Yeah, so this is honestly a 50-50 fight. I'll give my full prediction when the time comes, but I'm not going to give my full prediction just yet. But definitely the significant, definitely if we look at the significant strikes, definitely DDP has landed a lot more. Landed definitely. Kamaru has the more landed strikes. It seems like he has the better defense, the better has more faster striker grappling. Definitely, it's kind of a little bit even. So yeah, they're both very accurate on the feet, very accurate on the ground. I could definitely see this being a close fight. But just let me know who you guys think wins this fight between DDP and Kamaru Usman. Now, we're going to take a little quick look at the co-main event here. Jared Cannonier and Christian Leroy Duncan. Now, so, getting into UFC, you had these two fighters right here, which, I could definitely say were really good competition. Then, fought Ian Cubalata. Even though I know Ian Cubalata lost to Navajo Sterling yesterday, which, was dominating him the entire fight. That's still a good win. Losing to Glover Teixeira, you know, Roderick's a decent opponent. Losing to Jean Blachowicz, losing to Dominic Cruz, beating Branch, beating Anderson Silva. Even though I get Anderson Silva was definitely past his prime, but, against former world champion. Beating Jack Hermanson, beating Robert Whitaker, losing to Robert Whitaker, beating Calvin Gastelum, beating Derek Bronson, losing to Israel Adesanya, beating Sean Strickland in a robbery, I guess, beating Marvin Vettori, losing to Nursi Nimavov, losing to Kyle Bahayo, beating Gregor Rodriguez, and getting his by MVP most recently. So yeah, Jared Cannonier's fought at the top of this division. You can definitely say his biggest win was against Sean Strickland, which definitely was a robbery. But if you look at Christian Leroy's resume, getting into the UFC, he beat Tanavovic. And then Tanavovic, he was undefeated at the time. Then lost to Arman Prasharian, which is come from the UFC, beating Tuluyan, beating Khalid Ribeiro, and then losing to Greg Rodriguez. But it wasn't a bad loss because went the whole 3 rounds. Then beating Andre Pelaia, which Andre Pelaia, that's a good decent win. Beating Eric Anders, beating Marco Trulio, had his biggest win of his career over Roman Delizier. Honestly, man, Christian Leroy Duncan is one of my favorite prospects in this division. And this is honestly a close fight because, definitely a huge vet like Jared Cannonier. Jared Cannonier, obviously, we look at his last fight against MVP. He looked absolutely terrible. He did look like he needed to retire in that fight. And, if we just look at his last 3 fights, he's, technically supposed to be 0-3. In his last 3 fights. Beating Gregor Rodriguez because, he was getting dominated those 3 rounds. But, since Gregor Rodriguez, Robocop isn't used to 5-round fights, he got knocked out in the fourth round. But, I always say it was luck because, Jared Cannonier was prepared for that. But, Jared Cannonier, last 3 performances, even his fight before, his last 4, to be specific, he has had a very good performance. And really, the last time we ever seen a very good performance from Jared Cannonier was beating Derek Brunson. And Derek Brunson, honestly, that's really not that. That's a solid win. But Derek Brunson is just, okay. So, that was the last time, he really had a very impressive win. Ever since then, he's been having, decent fights over and over again. So, yeah, Jared Cannonier hasn't got a knockout. Well, no, not haven't got a knockout. He has had an impressive knockout since he fought Derek Brunson, and that was when? And that was in 2022, and we're in 2026, so that was about 4 years. That was about 4 years ago, guys. So that was last time he really had an impressive, knockout. And Christian Leroy Duncan, who do I say is better on the feet? I think definitely on the feet. Definitely Jared Cannonier can definitely give Christian Leroy Duncan some problems on the feet. Move around, definitely hit him with some very good clean shots. He could definitely knock him. I definitely think one of the things that comes with Christian Leroy's game plan is definitely his chin. He has a very good chin. He's faced some pretty hard hitters too, Robocop, Marco Trulio, all those other guys. On the ground, I don't know how good of a wrestler Jared Cannonier is, and we've seen Jared Cannonier struggles with technical fighters, and Christian Leroy Duncan is a pretty technical fighter. We've seen him struggle with Israel Adesanya, MVP. MVP, now we're seeing him evolve, and MVP and Narcine evolve, and Israel Adesanya are two different fighters. But Christian Leroy Duncan definitely has very good technique, better on the ground. This could definitely be a very easy night for Christian Leroy Duncan, and I'm kind of concerned for Jared Cannonier coming into this fight. But if Jared Cannonier, I feel like Jared Cannonier definitely would probably has to knock him out. I'm not saying who exactly I'm winning, but I think that could definitely be happening. I've been going back and forth on who I actually picked for this one because we've seen Christian Leroy Duncan get clipped a few good times throughout his career. But yeah, it's the co-main event, main event, definitely 2 50-50 fights, and I feel like definitely whoever wins this fight could definitely get the loser of the main event for sure. If let's say if Kamaru Usman loses, the loser can fight the loser of this fight, and that is depending on who exactly loses. If Kamaru Usman loses and it's oh, I want to go back to welterweight, then yeah, possibly not. But if you decides to stay, then that for sure that could definitely be an opponent. But yeah, let me know in the comments who do you guys think wins the main event and co-main event between DDP and Kamaru Usman, and I'll see you on the next, and Jared Cannonier and Christian Leroy Duncan. I'll see you on the next one. Bye. I'm out.